so it's pretty quiet. But yeah.
Do you know what I did the other day? I was having a meeting with civil servants, and Vicky was up here doing one meeting, so boring background, you know. And I went downstairs, and as you know, there's like pictures of the Labour Prime Ministers on our wall, right? And I sat down and went to start the meeting, the Skype meeting, not thinking about what was behind me. Of course, civil servants, all non-political, blah blah blah. And I saw it as like, oh no, this looks like I'm really trying too hard to make a point. You know, got all the prime ministers behind me. So I quickly took the pictures down and then shared my screen like that. A bit silly, really.
Oh bless.
Yeah, these are the challenges, though, aren't they?
I know. Oh, we're being recorded now.
Oh, are we? Okay.
Yeah.
What a shame. I was about to say something to Ian.
What's this?
I said, what a shame. I was about to say something to you, Ian, but as we're being recorded, I think I'll keep it to that.
Yeah, that's after 9 o'clock. You can talk like that, don't worry.
We're after the watershed now.
Yeah, it's going to be watershed of this.
I hope we're not going to be on to 9 o'clock.
No. Keep it clean, please.
What time are we going on till, Ian?
I don't know. We can get breakfast in if you want. Well,
sorry to ask a serious question though. Is anyone really struggling with having stared at a screen for 3 hours? Because I'm kind of in headache territory and I suffer from migraines, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, we're nearly there. Don't worry. We've only got a couple more. It's just part of the modernisation and community safety to go. And there's not many questions been indicated, so I think we'll get through it pretty quickly.
Humara, it's best if you're getting headaches, just move away from the screen every now and then.
Yeah, I've been trying to do that, but I don't know why today I'm really, really struggling. So, and I know that, you know, anyone would struggle in a 3-hour meeting, but I get headaches that sometimes become migraines, and I'll be wiped out for the next 3 days if that's the case. So,
without everyone chiming in, I've taken to sometimes using my earphones and just not using the screen at all. Might be one you consider. It would mean though that you'd have to go off mute.
Yeah. I think everybody's back on. Is Jason on? I can't see him. You on, Jason? No, Jason's not on.
I'm on. I've been hearing your banter.
Oh, right. Good. Silent but deadly, as always. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we're all aboard. So I think we'll kick off again, if that's okay. We're on the housing and modernisation. I think Victor had a question. Is that correct?
I did, Chair. I just wanted to really welcome the Council's emergency response to rough sleeping during the pandemic. And there've been lots of very sort of important and encouraging statements about how we come out of the pandemic for rough sleepers. But we haven't actually had a commitment to ensuring that all those that are being temporarily housed are not going to be forced to return to the streets after the pandemic. And this feels like another golden opportunity to make sure that we're accelerating that housing first policy that we believe in locally. So can we get that reassurance that nobody will have to return to the street after the lockdown?
Thank you.
Hi, Victor. As I said, that's absolutely what we're determined to do everything we can to achieve. I had some good news today that 19 of the people that we've housed off the streets have moved on already into permanent accommodation. So, we're making progress on that already. Additionally, we've funded another worker who will start at the Southwark Law Centre on Monday to help people get their settled immigration status in the UK, so that, again, that's easier for them to stay. So we're going to do absolutely everything we can. But as I say, it is a difficult situation, and we do also need the government to act, and I can't take that away from it at all. We need the government to give some basic things that they can easily do to ensure that people have the access, particularly to benefits that they need to be able to fund their own long-term home.
I appreciate that. Funding will be key to this, but are we making any specific approaches to government on the homelessness issue and the rough sleeping specifically around ensuring?
Absolutely. So we and at all levels. I mean, Peter might want to say something on this as well. But I've been in contact directly with Louise Casey. Our officers are working with officers across London and London councils and nationally through the LGA to look at local government's position on this. There is an emerging plan for London to make sure that no one returns to the streets, called In for Good, and we're working to support that as well. I think, to be fair to the government, there are certainly people within government who understand the importance here. And apart from anything else, clearly rough sleeping is the visible form of homelessness. And they know not only is it the right thing to do, but there will be political consequences for them if people end up back on the streets again. So I think there's a door we can keep pushing at, but we're not there yet in terms of getting the firm commitments we need from them.
And just very quickly, Chair, we know that there is a housing crisis in London, and this pandemic is just exposing it and showing how many people are living in really unsuitable forms of accommodation. A huge chunk of our local residents do live in the private rented sector, and I think there's loads of really fantastic work going on to help tenants in of the council and of housing associations. But are we doing anything around supporting people that are in the private rented sector that are often living in quite crummy or overcrowded accommodation, or just unsuitable for their needs?
Vicky might want to add to this as well, because she leads on private rented accommodation. I'll just talk about the homelessness bit of that. And what we haven't yet seen is a big surge in people who are homeless from private rented accommodation as a result of this change. And you'd expect that because the government have stopped all evictions. What worries me is that we will see that. The restrictions on evictions from private rented and all landlords are temporary. People will, we know, be building up arrears, and they will be at the mercy of their landlords when those restrictions come down again. And we may well see a large increase in people who have ended up unable to pay their rents and that their landlords are not sympathetic with them. One thing that the government could absolutely do now to help with that is the commitment they'd already made to end Section 21 evictions. So at the moment, landlords don't have to, they don't have to build a case. They can just move people out on a whim, essentially, and particularly where they've built up arrears. They've got an easy way to do it. So, I think there's a real need for the government on private rented to make a commitment, A, on implementing Section 21, and B, on giving some long-term security.
Okay. Yeah, I think the risk of a kind of...
Who's that? Oh, right, Vicky, yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, if that's okay. So I think there is a real risk of a kind of the homelessness spike coming much later in the year. Many people who are in the private rented sector and have perhaps experienced a loss of income or are applying for universal credit at the moment, this may well be the first time that they have kind of gone through that process and been dependent on the welfare system. And it's very likely that the choices that they made, perhaps around private rented accommodation, were not based on being dependent on welfare. And there could be a very, very large gap between what their rent is and what they now get as income. And I think there is a very, very high risk of arrears being built up and then a lot of evictions later on in the year. And I do think the government needs to act both on kind of making sure that the pause on the evictions does not just come to an end, as Kieran said. And I think, again, it's that question of, even though there's been an increase in the local housing allowance, there is still a huge gap in what the average private rented property costs in Southwark versus what you can get in terms of local housing allowance, and that is something that we have to continue to press on. In terms of kind of private rented sector queries, in terms of standards in the private rented sector, actually what we found during lockdown is that queries have gone down, but the team are very well placed to deal with all those queries that are coming in. And a lot of kind of consultations and questions have been dealt with kind of on video, which is good, and it shows us that we can work in a different way. But I think there's a risk that once we come out of lockdown, there might be a backlog of queries, just as there, we've already heard that there's going to be in council properties as well.
Okay, thank you. Alice, did you have a question?
Yes, I have two questions, one on housing and one on domestic violence. So on the housing side, it's similar to Gavin's. I guess there are people who are, we know there's a housing crisis, but kind of people on band 2, like people who, needed housing and were on the waiting list, but because of the situation and then in their houses all the time, overcrowded, people with illnesses, how are we deciding? And obviously we not want to move people around under lockdown, but how are we deciding and prioritising some of those cases, just to get a sense of, I guess, the urgent nature of those and how we're assessing them. And then my second one on domestic violence, and we touched on some of that at the beginning, but obviously, like, reporting is one thing. We all know that there's loads of hidden domestic violence going on. Obviously, we have a policy that the perpetrator should move as much as possible. And in the report, it doesn't really give that much information on what some of the outcomes have been in terms of those cases. So is there any information in terms of have perpetrators moved, and how is that working? And are we looking at, if that is not the case, how, have actually the victims or survivors been rehoused as well? So just be good to understand what some of the outcomes, and we might not know that yet, are on those cases.
So I'll come in on the first of those two. So in terms of housing allocations at the moment, I think most members will know that we suspended choice-based lettings at the beginning of this crisis. So we did that for two reasons. Well, one reason really, I suppose, to make sure that we could give housing to people who urgently needed it, specifically because of COVID-19. That included rough sleepers, but it also included moving people out of accommodation with shared facilities. So at the beginning of this, at the beginning of the lockdown, we had, I think it was 690 households in total who were in accommodation with where they were sharing kitchens or bathrooms. We've now got that down, moved over 500 of those people into non-shared accommodation, and we're still working to do that for the rest as well. That has meant that we've had to freeze the allocations process, so people who are normally bidding are not being able to. We have, in exceptional cases, as we often do, made some direct offers to people where there's a specific need for an emergency move for someone, and we can continue to do that, but that's a relatively small number. Most people will continue to be the band they're in and will rebid when they come on. And the last thing I'll say on this is it is worth saying the number of people on our waiting list has gone up again over the last period. So whereas it was previously about 11,000, it's now up to 12,000.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I know Michael wanted to come in earlier. Sorry, Michael. I should have called you earlier.
No, not to worry. I'll only just add one figure, which is that we have helped over 400 rough sleepers off the streets into accommodation that's suitable for the moment. That's way beyond our ability to sustain long term. And I've been in discussions, as have colleagues, with senior civil servants in MHCLG about what the details of the plan will be to make sure that as the lockdown is lifted and those hotels return to their normal business, that there will be a place for every single person. So I'm not in a position to say that's been agreed, but that discussion has been a serious discussion. I absolutely believe that the will is there to do it, but we haven't got that as yet nailed down. We've actually done slightly better than Kieran suggests, so it's nice to be able to say that on taking people out of shared accommodation. We've gone from the figure that he said, over 650 to under 100 left in shared accommodation, which we've only been able to do because we've had to freeze the normal allocations and rehousing process. But that has meant that people who are very vulnerable because of the lack of ability to be able to isolate can now do that. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Michael. Peter Babudu, did you have a question on temporary accommodation?
Oh, sorry, just the domestic violence question. I haven't had an answer on. Don't know if I
Yeah, well, we'll come to that in a minute because I know somebody else wants to ask a question about that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Peter?
No, I'm fine at this stage, Chair.
Okay, good. Jane, you had a question? Overcrowding.
Thank you very much, Chair. I realise we don't have a limitless supply of housing, but it has been suggested that one of the reasons that COVID has been rampant in certain parts of our society is to do with overcrowding. And when we've been asking children to work at home and things like this, but we consider a sitting room to be the equivalent of a bedroom. Therefore, you have 3 children in a 2-bedroom property. They're all trying to, you know, have a bit of quiet time to do homework or do schoolwork. Isn't it time that we took a look at what we consider to be the criteria for overcrowding? Because I think a lot's going to come out the other side of this, but a big thing is going to be how many people are in one property and for how long, and what we do about moving them on as quickly as possible. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a hugely important point. As others have said earlier in the meeting, I think what's going to be very clear when we get all the analysis at the end of this process is that the impact is going to be by far hardest on those who are in the most difficult conditions to start with, whether that be financial or indeed living in overcrowding. I think that's going to be clear in many different ways. On definitions of overcrowding, I think it's worth saying, and Michael might want to come in on this, but there are 2 definitions of overcrowding we use as a council. One of them is set nationally by government, and is the one that you're referring to, where a living room is counted as a sleeping room, and we have to give particular priority to that under the national frameworks. And the second one is a probably more reasonable definition to a person on the street of overcrowding, that is our council one, which again people get priority for, but not as much. We are in the process of reviewing our housing allocations policy. So we will be consulting on that. In fact, we were due to do that about now, but it's been put back by everything that's happening. And so there will be a chance for you to comment on that, as well as as members of the public. So we will look at all of those things and the relative priority that people are given. But, you know, I think to conclude on all of that, what's clear is we're facing an enormous housing crisis nationally, and the people in our borough who are suffering from it are suffering even more in the current context.
Great. Thank you. Leanne, did you have a question in regard to child abuse or something?
I asked that question earlier, and I think Alice has covered the questions on domestic abuse, so I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we'll go back to, I just wanted to double check, make sure we took them together. Alice's question then on domestic violence. Who's going to deal with that?
So Alex, can you just repeat the question? Maybe I can help with that.
Sure, it was just kind of understanding, we've got lots of the statistics in terms of reporting of cases, and I'm just wondering in terms of some of the outcomes, and maybe we don't know that, but in terms of how kind of perpetrators left, have some of the survivors left, like is that kind of policy working? And I guess it cuts into Kieran's brief as well, but it was just understanding some of like how the outcomes have changed after COVID, as well as the reporting of cases.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I for one, don't have the answer for that, to be honest. Gathering information on victims, especially if they either, I mean, for example, we have a sanctuary system whereby we support tenants to stay within their homes, and trying to gather data on basically how long they've stayed in that particular apartment after a certain period of time has been quite difficult, because we are having to work through solace, and it's you know, and most of this information is by consent, you know, and you can imagine a lot of these survivors just want to be left alone to move on with their lives. So it's very difficult to gather information. I'm not sure if Stephen is still on, and whether he's got any information to kind of complement what I've just said.
Sorry, I don't have. Sorry, Chair. I don't have figures on outcomes. What I can say is that I mean, sadly, as has been said before, we'd expect in this period there to be a spike in cases or in reporting as lockdown eases. Having said all of that, all of the normal things that we do are in place, albeit working in a different way. So the multi-agency risk assessment conferences that risk assess and hold cases, they're still going on, and solutions are being found for survivors and ways of dealing with perpetrators. So that continues virtually, and we have put, as has been mentioned earlier, additional resource into Solace for people to support survivors. So all of that carries on. I just don't have those figures to hand on outcomes. The thing that is, I mean, is an interesting feature and applies to community safety more widely, is that generally speaking, relating to crime rates are down generally, but however, arrests are up. And they are up because people are at home and the police find it easier to apprehend perpetrators. So and that has included domestic abuse perpetrators. So the police, and I was talking to them earlier today about this, continue to do that and continue to make arrests in connection with things like domestic abuse, but across all of the crime types. But I can come back to outcomes. Obviously, it's quite early days, but I can provide some data on that.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Michael, you wanted to come in?
Just very quickly to say that we have made a small but significant change to practice during this lockdown on the treatment, the way we treat homeless applications related to domestic violence, which is that they are automatically classified as priority and treated thus. So at the moment, because everything else is gummed up and isn't working, our policy of saying that the perpetrator must go, which may require legal action, sometimes the courts to intervene, isn't really very credible. So we're making sure that it is mainly women who need it will have somewhere, and they are a priority.
Okay, that's great. Is that all right, Alice?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And yeah, follow up on the data would be great when you do have any of it.
Great, thank you. Humera, I just want you to ask the question in relation to the cemeteries. I know we're going backwards to environment again, but could you just ask that question for now, please?
Yeah, sorry, something's happened to my sound, so I can't hear you guys very well anymore. So I understand when it comes to burials in Southwark, I want to tie two challenges together. The majority of our Muslim population are within the BME community, and we've said that there's been a higher death rate in the BME camp. Nationally, that may not be the case in Southwark. But I understand that we only have 13 burial plots for Muslims. So I'm curious to understand how we've been handling that shortfall, and what's happening with burials for people who have specific faith requirements. Are they having to go and be buried somewhere else, or is there a delay to burial?
Okay, thank you. Is Richard or Caroline?
Yeah, no, I can cover that one, Ian. Whilst Councillor Ali is right that there aren't a huge number of Muslim burial spots left, which are at Nunhead Cemetery, we still have 13 left, and we haven't found that that's creating a problem at the moment. So I mean, obviously we need to sort of keep a close eye on these things, and of course not every Muslim family will want a Muslim burial place as such. But we are keeping a close eye on the position at the moment. Those 13 are there, so that wouldn't prevent any burial taking place. And as far as I know, there haven't been any issues about Muslim families not being able to bury because of that situation. So whilst Councillor Ali is right to raise an issue that longer term there may be a bit of a resilience issue there we need to look into, it's not an immediate problem. And so we are looking at those things and what we can do.
Thank you, Richard. And if I could just add, if I may, when I had your brief, a lot of Muslim families actually buried their relatives with other relatives that were cemeteries north of the river. So, Tower Hamlets, etc., etc. So, as you say, not every Muslim family will want to use the facilities in Southwark.
That's absolutely right.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so sorry, you can ask the next question now, Humera, about registrars and coroners. Was there something you wanted on that?
No, sorry, that was related. That's where I've tied the burial piece.
Oh, I see.
My apologies, but I did have a digital democracy question.
Okay, well, let's do that one now then. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously everyone's had to adapt, and it's welcome actually that we're trying to do things online in a modern way, and legislation was passed to enable to do that. However, one of the largest concerns at the start of this was the possible exclusion of a number of groups to be able to participate in the democratic process. And we've talked earlier on in the meeting about those, for example, in an education space, those families who don't have equipment to be able to educate their children, some of our older generation who are not digitally literate. And I wanted to ask the question on what the view of officers were on this particular matter, whether it's been successful, and whether there is a future for this with the technology we currently have.
Thank you. Who's going to pick that up?
Do you want me to pick that up, Chair? I'm happy to pick that up. And we did touch slightly on digital exclusion earlier in terms of children and young people having access to education. So that's one element of it. I think my answer to the question was probably we need to reflect on what the good things have been about this emergency and how we harness that, but also how we make sure that we are focusing attention on people that don't have access to technology. It's an example, I think, that's quite similar to the walking and cycling example. There are things that have been brilliant out of this emergency, as dreadful and horrible as this emergency has been, and we need during the period of recovery to just think about how we take advantage of those things, because there are both advantages and disadvantages. But one of the things that we will be particularly keen to do when we can is open our libraries, for example, so that people have got access to the internet. And obviously a lot of people use the internet that don't have in libraries that don't have the internet at home. So I think this is going to be one of the things that we're currently in the response, in the emergency stage, but as we come out of it, there are lots of lessons that we need to learn as an organisation to go forward in a progressive way. So we have a progressive recovery. We don't return to the norm that we had before.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Michael, did you want to add something?
Just briefly to say, Chair, that 98% of our homeless households making applications have successfully done so using their phones or online. That actually is higher than I thought it would be. And actually many of them have said that they much prefer that approach to having to come into Bournemouth Road and sit in the waiting room and queue, particularly if they've got to bring their children with them. And almost astonishingly, really, our satisfaction rates, as recorded by people saying how they felt they've been looked after, have actually gone up during this crisis. We've also carried on doing some consultation with tenants on works that have been carried out on their homes. That seems to have gone successfully as well. So I don't for one second think that we have complete coverage. There will be people for whom it's not working. We are continuing after we have been, and we will continue after the lockdown, to increase the coverage of free Wi-Fi, high-speed broadband in our community halls, tenant and resident halls. That will give people an opportunity for free access as well.
Okay, thank you. Hugh Mary, you wanted to come back in again?
No, apologies, sorry. I think I was just saying that there's a question from maybe towards the end when we talk about the future response.
Okay, fine.
I'll follow up in there.
Okay. Do you want to ask your question on the HR one then now?
Okay. So it's been fantastic that we've managed to retrain, repurpose staff, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. We're able to respond to that fairly quickly. I have a data request in terms of understanding what proportion of staff were able to be reassigned versus those that were able to continue doing their role versus those that were unable to do both. So what proportion of our workforce particularly was unable to be reassigned or be able to continue their work?
So certainly we can have a look and come back to that. Michael might want to give some more figures on this, but I think broadly speaking, as an example, we've had about 200 staff move across to work on the hub, community hub. So that's entirely redeployed staff. But of course, many of us have continued in their existing roles, albeit doing perhaps different work. So, for example, our resident services officers have been very largely doing calls to our residents who are most vulnerable at this time to check that they are well and have all the support and access to food, etc., that they need. So, same job, but doing different work. But we could certainly come back to you on your request.
Okay, is that all right, Mo? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I may write to officers later.
Okay. Can you ask your fourth question now, please?
Sorry, I didn't realise it was me keeping this meeting going longer. So sorry. So in the last section, it talks about next steps into recovery and renewal. And I think I just have there's an overall piece there talking about, in terms of those next steps, there sounds like there's lots of activities happening, but I feel that we're a little bit unsighted on that. And will there be some sort of cross-party movement to be able to provide some steer, is one part of that question. And secondly, where we have introduced new things such as the hub, that in theory comes to an end at some point, and there may be this sort of gap or this delta, for example, when hub activities ramp down because council staff have to go back to their normal day jobs. What then happens to the holes that have been exposed in the community? And that's just one example of many. So it's a wider question about the future and how we might work together.
Okay, before Kieran or Michael comes in, I just want to add to that, if I may. I mean, certainly from a corporate perspective, you know, we had a corporate plan before with specific targets and specific timescales. Obviously, the crisis has affected that, and therefore I think it's important that the council and the public needs to know what the knock-on effect has been for those corporate targets and timescales. I know there's been mention of a report coming in September, but to be perfectly frank, I think that's too far away. I think, you know, we need to have something in more detail by July, to be perfectly frank, and I appreciate your views on that. And also tied up to that is obviously, I suppose, at some stage, we will be revising our emergency plan, and I'd like to know your comments in relation to that point. And then just on the hubs, as you know, the voluntary sector at the cabinet meeting made it quite clear that they saw, or they would like to see, the continuance of some local hubs once this is blown over. So again, if you could comment on that point, please. Thank you.
So, Chair, I'm not sure if Peter has had to leave the call or not. I can give it a little bit of a stab in terms of kind of the council plan. Oh, he's still here. Okay.
Yeah.
If you'd rather do it then.
Well, I mean, I'm sure Vicky can answer as well, but we are doing urgent work over the next couple of weeks, Chair, to look at those elements of the corporate plan which are not relevant in the current circumstances, and also looking at those new priorities which will have emerged as a result of COVID-19. That is something then which will have to work its way through the council framework in order to become the new and revised corporate plan, but that will be happening in a matter of weeks rather than months. As I said at the outset of the meeting, it's all going to be slightly informed by the financial basis that we're able to have at that point when we're reviewing things. and some tough choices will have to be made, I have no doubt. But that bit of work will be happening. At the same time, we're looking at how the council as a whole operates and our staff operate in the new changed context. And the other piece of work that we will be doing. No, I've covered corporate plan and new priorities, etc. So I think yeah, I mean, we'll be doing what you said. Oh, Councillor Ali asked, will there be opportunity for cross-party working on this, or a task force or something of that nature? I mean, it will be a new corporate plan which will be developed in the way that corporate plans are traditionally developed, and that will be subject to scrutiny and subject to involvement of all members through the corporate process.
Okay, Humera, did you want to say anything? No.
Not for now. Thank you.
All right, Duncan, did you want to make a comment? You there, Duncan?
Sorry, yes, just very briefly, one of the highlights of the early summer will be the budget remit report, which we intend to bring to Cabinet in July. Now, this will be setting out what our resources are anticipated to be for 21-22. It will be a very wide of numbers, and it will be on the downside, not the upside. But that, I think, will be an opportunity within the report to capture a lot of the issues that are on around all of the things that we've started to do, and as we normalise as we come out of the lockdown, I hope. But that will, I think, be quite an important report to focus on.
Can I just say, Chair, I hear the very strong point you made about July rather than September, and I think the commitment that we need to give is that we kind of put out there the work that we're doing, and actually a huge amount has already gone on in terms of looking at our finances, looking at the HRA business plan, looking at how we can kind of close off the last 2 years of our council plan and migrate to a new one. I do think in terms of having a really kind of clear vision of kind of what we can deliver over the next 2 years and what the finances that underpins that is, we can do something that's pretty good by July, but I think you're going to have a little bit more than that for us to fully understand and remodel the finances behind things, which is why I think September has been mentioned as well. I'm just being kind of honest and realistic. At this stage, we're in terms of income, we're only 1 month into kind of this financial year, so really fully predicting what the whole in our finance is going to be in terms of income is very difficult.
Sure. No, I fully appreciate that, but I think from the public point of view, they probably, just whatever figures we can put out in July, they don't have to be substantive, but certainly, general or broad brush, but to give some sort of
absolutely. I don't think now is the time to kind of make promises or commitments that we are not going to be able to deliver on. I think absolutely the crisis that we've seen in our community requires kind of really transparent leadership and us being absolutely clear what we want to do and how we can genuinely deliver it.
Right, good. I see that one of the recommendations that was agreed by Cabinet was the creation of a new director post. I just wondered what the extra cost was in relation to that, because it's not contained in the report, and how many directors does that give us overall now in the organisation?
I'm happy to cover that. Oh, are you going to do it, Duncan, or?
I was simply going to say, in terms of finances covered within our existing resources, so there's no additional cost to the council. It'll be restructuring and movement of staff and natural turnover elsewhere. But in terms of the posts over to Caroline, I think, if that's okay.
Yep, sure.
So the post is temporarily for as long as it's needed. It changes Stephen Gaskell's role of head of Chief Exec's office to a director level post to deal with the post COVID response. It will take his base grade, and then the job is currently being evaluated at the moment. So I can't tell you at the moment what it's come out at. It's subject to Hay evaluation. The true cost will be the difference between his current substantive post and this temporary post. But I think we all recognise that the recovery from COVID is going to be so massive and so all-encompassing for the organisation that we have to have a role that is able to look across the council and coordinate and support the whole thing. So I think the costs are minimal, but the impact will be substantial, I would hope.
Okay, so do I take it from that then that once the crisis is over, he will revert to his substantive post?
Yes, it's a temporary change to his post, but I can't tell you how long that's going to last. It's just it's not a permanent director post. We're not creating a new permanent director post.
Great, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you very much. Has any other members got any other questions they wish to raise at this point? I think we've come more or less to the end of the report. So thank you once again for your patience. I know it's taken best part of 3 hours, but there we are. Can I say I'd like to make this suggestion, if I may, to the members of the committee. I don't think we've got really time this evening to deliberate on any recommendations we may wish to make. And what I was going to do, if that's all right by you, is to hold that over until we meet on the 12th of May. As you know, we have a meeting then scheduled. So if anybody does have any particular points they wish to formulate as a recommendation, then perhaps you could come to that meeting with them rather than us having to discuss it all again. Does that sound a sensible way forward to members?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Excellent.
That makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, so we've reached the end of the meeting now. So I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions this evening. I know it's been a long evening, and I apologise for that. But given the gravity of the situation, the fact that this borough has been in the heart of it to a certain extent, we had to give it full consideration and scrutinise it properly this evening. And I think we've given it that. So thank you all for your participation this evening, and thank members of the public and others who've joined us this evening. And I'm sure we'll have an equally productive meeting when we meet on the 12th of May. So thank you all again, and good night, and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.